what I would like to do is we'll start out with the basic lock-picking procedures, and by basic I mean the pin-by-pin technique. The best way to learn locksmithing is one-on-one, to have somebody sitting down right next to you showing you exactly what you should be doing, but it's hard to do that for a class. So I've put together a videotape that we'll be looking at in segments so that you can see the close-up parts of what I need to show you. And then we'll practice that. I'll circulate around and give anyone help who needs it. So feel free to raise your hand if you do need help. Are there any questions at all? How many of you have lockpicking experience? 1, 2 or 3? Okay. All right. Well, I've taught several thousand students, and what I've found during that time is that people who are new to locksmithing break down into about 3 different groups. There's always about 10% who just take to it like gangbusters. It's like they have some kind of genetic predisposition to opening locks. They open the course lock, then they open every lock in their house, and then they go over to their neighbors and they open all their locks. They're just great at it. There's another corresponding 10% that just really aren't that good. They just seem to have problems from the get-go. And usually these are people who have trouble understanding the basic concepts. And by basic concepts, I mean how a pin tumbler lock works and exactly what you're trying to do when you pick it. And then about 80% have a moderate degree of success. They practice some within 8-10 hours. They have all the foundation they need to continue practicing and get better. One thing I have noticed is that the 10% that start out being bad with practice become even better than the 10% who are really good that don't practice. So you'll hear me talk a lot today about practicing. If you want to become good at lockpicking, you're going to have to practice. And so that's our goal today, is to get you to a point where you can go back and practice picking locks. And this is a really fun subject. I mean, this is not real dry, lots of theoretical, mathematical type stuff. It takes some kind of feel, a little bit of a knack for what you're doing, and you have to understand, like I said, how the pin tumbler operates. So let me start with our first video segment. We'll do a couple of exercises and then we'll start picking. The 2 parts of a lock cylinder that are easiest to identify is the lock plug and the lock shell. The plug contains the keyway of the lock, and it's designed to rotate when the correct key is inserted. The shell of the lock extends around the plug. The shell also contains a chamber that holds the pin stacks in place. In this lock you can see this brass retaining bar is holding in a series of pin stacks. We'll talk a little bit more about what pin stacks are in just a minute. If you look at the back of the plug, you'll see a tailpiece. There are different kinds of tailpieces. We'll go into those in detail in the course. But it's just important to know that the tailpiece usually has 2 functions. One is to hold the lock plug into place. In this case, it's held in by these 2 screws. And then the other function is to unlock or to trip whatever security mechanism that the lock is designed to operate in. In this case, the tailpiece is a cam. As you turn the key, the cam rotates down, and in this specific type of mortise cylinder, the cam would activate a locking mechanism to unlock the door, to toggle the door either locked or unlocked. Here's another type of pin tumbler. This one has a different shaped shell than the last one. This is a Kwikset residential lock, and specifically for a dead latch. You'll notice that there are
two holes for mounting the lock, and then the shell encases the lock plug just like in the other lock we just saw. This tailpiece is different than in the mortise cylinder we just saw. It does not by itself hold in the lock plug. That's done by this spring clip. And instead of rotating in a vertical way, this lock turns the tailpiece horizontally. But again, the tailpiece just functions to contact whatever locking mechanism we have inside the lock. Very different appearing than the first one, but exactly the same type of lock. In this type you can also see the chamber for the pin stacks very easily. In fact, this is a retainer cap that you can remove and replace, as opposed to the brass retainer we saw on the mortise cylinder. You can see more easily with this lock that there is a space on the lock shell designed to hold the pin stacks. You've probably noticed from looking at keys that each key has cuts in it, and these cuts are to varying depths. In some ways you can think of the depths of these cuts as being the combination for a particular lock. We've talked about a pin stack, so let's define that now. A pin stack consists of a bottom pin, a top pin, and a spring. In this lock, there are 5 pin stacks. Now you'll notice from the key that this is the correct key because the bottom pins raise to the same height when this key is inserted. The bottom pins are the pins that you'll find in the plug. When the key correctly raises the bottom pins to this height, then the lock plug can rotate, and it rotates based on the gap between these pins. If the pins are all lined up, you can see that there's a straight line where there's a gap between the top and bottom pin. The spring stays in the lock shell, and it serves as downward force to make sure that the pins do fall into the lock plug and pass the lock plug into the lock shell when this key is taken out. To better understand how all this works together, we're going to use this lock cylinder, which is very similar to the ones that we looked at before, except that this cylinder has been cut away so that you can actually see how the plug and the pins interact. We're going to clamp this in a vise and get a closer look, and that should really lock in for you how the pin tumbler operates and exactly what the function of the pin stacks is. The cutaway lock is a great training aid because it allows you to see how all the components of the lock work together in different circumstances. Let's begin by inserting a key blank into the lock, that is a key with no cuts in it, which will cause all the pins in the lock to be raised to their highest positions. You can see that the bottom pins, which are purple in this case, are raised above the shear line so that the lock still can't open. This view gives you the best idea of an entire pin stack and how it works in the plug. Now let's take a look at how the lock is with the correct key inserted. You can see that the bottom pins, or rather the top pins, have been aligned in a straight line. That's because the top pins in this lock are all the same length, and they're being driven by spring pressure down to the shear line, but they don't cross it. As you can see here, the bottom pins are being retained in the plug, so that as you rotate the lock, the pins stay in the plug. That's one reason that you can't remove a key from a lock once you've turned it. Once we get it back to the locking position, you can watch the top pins come down, lock up the plug so that the lock can't turn. One final condition is when the incorrect key is inserted into the lock. You'll notice that in these two pin stacks, the bottom pins have been raised above the shear line, while in this far right pin stack and this pin stack, the top pins have been driven into the plug. So unless the key is cut to the exact combination that will raise them to the right height, so that the gap between the plugs, or the gap between the pins, is aligned with the top of the plug, can the lock open. Let's begin with a very fast, simple exercise that you can do to get a lot of information about a lock before you pick it. To do this, we're going to use a standard diamond point pick. We're going to rotate the pick upside down so that we have a flat blade all the way across. Then we're going to insert the pick into the lock all the way to the back. Raise up on the pick so that we're retaining all the pins in their most upward position, and then we're going to slowly remove as we count the number of pins. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, that's telling us that we have a standard 5-pin pin tumbler lock. It's also telling us that all the pin stacks inside the lock are working fine. That is, there's no broken springs or no jammed pins. And it's also giving me some feedback on exactly how the lock, the state of the lock. For example, because the pins are snapping back so sharply, I know that this is a relatively new lock that has very good springs because they're snapping so fast back into the keyway. That's going to affect how much plug tension we use and how much upward force we're going to have to use to pick the lock. You might want to do it several times because it just takes a few seconds, but it'll give you a lot of information about a lock before you even begin picking it. The next thing we're going to address is plug tension. It's impossible to pick a lock unless you apply the correct tension to it. And actually, it's torque, but in the industry, it's commonly referred to as tension that we apply to the plug of the lock. One of the most important factors is exactly how much force we use. The tension wrench is inserted into the keyway of the lock and turned. Usually you want to keep your finger at the furthest point down on the pick as you possibly can. That'll give you just a more uniform amount of tension. And you can use this wrench to turn turn the plug either counterclockwise, like we're doing right now, or clockwise by just reinserting it on the other side and putting tension that way. It's impossible to pick a lock without tension on the plug. You'll just have to learn by experience how much to use to pick a lock. One way